Welcome back. You've found your way to another quiet corner of the dark. I'm StorySpectre. Tonight's tale comes from the forests of Maine, a quiet place where the cold never truly leaves, and sometimes the silence remembers your name. So take a deep breath. Let the world outside fade away. You don't need to do anything now. Just listen. This is the woods outside my cabin, and if you listen closely, you might still hear what stayed behind. The cabin sat at the edge of a shallow basin where the black spruces thickened until they became more than trees, until they were a kind of boundary. In daylight, it looked like a picture on a travel brochure from 20 years ago, a square of brown wood with a low roof sagging under last winter's stubbornness. One stovepipe, one door, 2 windows, and a porch whose boards had learned to be quiet. In darkness, the cabin seemed to belong to the trees rather than to the man who had paid for it. His name was Evan. He had come north in late November without telling many people why. It was partly to finish a grant report he had promised an institution that measured time with funding cycles, partly to stop hearing his own apartment talk to him through the refrigerator and the pipes and the neighbor's footsteps, partly to test an old idea about solitude, that it could be a cure rather than a mirror. He brought a duffel, a tote full of books and printouts, a laptop he intended not to use much, and a habit of making coffee even when coffee didn't improve anything. He told the ranger on the road in that he'd be respectful. The ranger, a woman in her 50s with weather in the corners of her eyes, looked at his city tires and nodded like a person placing a polite bet. The first afternoon was an inventory. The cabin had electricity when it felt like cooperating, a stove that would keep him from resenting the cold, a bed with a wool blanket that smelled clean in a way only air makes things clean, and a shelf of objects the last renter had forgotten to care about. A warped deck of cards, a jar of screws, a church bulletin from 5 summers ago, and a single glove that had lost its partner so thoroughly it had become philosophical. Evan carried in wood. He liked the sound of it aligning with itself in the rack. He tested the water from the pump and declared it an acquired taste. He set the kettle on the stove top and waited for the fist of steam that would say it was working. By the time dusk arrived, he'd taken notes on a legal pad, real notes with dates and headings and lines between ideas. The work felt honest, the way manual work is honest. He watched the trees become their own shadows. He watched color thin itself. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and stood at the window and said aloud, "All right," because the room seemed to need a word to hang the evening on. The first night taught him something about the way the forest breathes. It is not lungs. It is not a mammal next door. The forest takes in heat and light all day without telling you and lets them go at once when the sky stops giving. The release has a sound, small, dry, collective, that passes over a house and through it and away. He listened to that release and felt as if the world had flattened to let him lie on it more comfortably. He slept with his socks on and the lamp off and woke only once, not because of a noise, but because of the absence of one. It was the kind of quiet that feels like a room waiting to introduce itself. In the morning, the frost had written its slow grammar on the porch boards. Evan left his first prints in it and thought, briefly and a little sentimentally, that he liked to see where he'd been. Coffee and oatmeal, and the day began. He read a stack of articles about watershed restoration and underlined sentences that seemed certain of themselves. He typed 3 paragraphs and erased 1. At noon, the light turned to tin. Tiny snow came, not flakes yet, but the idea of flakes, a thought the sky was considering. He walked the edge of the clearing with his hands in his jacket pockets and told himself names of trees like they were replies to a question. At dusk, he was tired in a kind way. He set another log in the stove and felt the skin on his face tighten with the new heat. He poured himself a little water and stood again at the window, because the window had become the place where he took his bearings. The trees were already darker than the air between them. It made a negative of the woods, a manuscript of black letters written on gray paper. Something shifted at the tree line, not a thing so much as the air remembering it had a shape to hold. Evan leaned forward until his breath made a cloud on the glass. A branch released its own weight, and the little snow on it fell with the softness of a decision. He smiled at himself. The forest is a magician whose tricks cost nothing. He went to bed early. The second night he woke because the cabin was listening. The boards had stopped their tiny thermal languages. The stovepipe had fallen silent. The fridge, when it felt like being a fridge, offered no hum. He lay very still and looked at the faint rectangle of the window, which was only darker than the wall by the smallest possible measure. In that space, a more specific stillness gathered, like a person entering the far end of a long hallway. Evan told himself it was wind he couldn't yet hear. He told himself it was snow changing its mind about being snow. He let 30 breaths move through him, and the stillness remained. When the first sound came, it was so modest it could have been his imagination trying to be helpful. A brush, like a cuff against wood. He thought of an animal, porcupine, fox, a deer curious enough to test the border of human. The brush came again, and this time he heard the shape of it. Not claws, not hooves, not rubber, not anything he could place. He got out of bed and stood barefoot. The floor had kept just enough of the stove's kindness to let him cross it without swearing. He went to the window and did the childish thing you still do when you're grown. He stood to one side and looked across the glass instead of straight through it, as if the angle could change who was allowed to see whom. The porch was a dim diagram: railing, chair, table, the bundle of wood he'd brought in from the rack, the broom he should have put back. Beyond it, the clearing was a circle of gray with darker gray at the edges. He waited until his eyes understood there would be nothing more to add. He breathed out and saw the breath rise and thin. He breathed in and smelled nothing. The brush came again, now below the window, now careful, as if asking the wood to introduce it to the house. Evan said, "Hello," because that is a word we use for situations when none of our other words know what to do. What answered him was not a voice. It was a slight shift of pressure, like a door on the far side of the forest had opened and let a pocket of air go. The chair on the porch creaked the way old chairs do when they remember people. He waited for his heart to catch up with his decisions. He did not open the door. He went back to bed. He lay on his side with his hand on his jacket, not for the jacket, but for the keys in its pocket, as if a car out among the trees could do anything about any of this. The brush and the creak came once more, then not again. He slept in colorless slices and woke with the dumb gratitude of a person whose ordinary body has been returned to him. There were marks in the morning because sometimes the world is courteous enough to show you what was true when you couldn't name it. The frost on the porch had been smudged into dullness in a shape that made no declarative statements. Ovals, a drag, nothing with the crisp grammar of tracks. In the strip of dirt between the steps and the bottommost branch of the nearest spruce, he found a single print. It looked like a foot until you asked it to be specific, and then it looked like the sketch of a foot by someone who had insisted on finishing in a hurry. The toes had spread. The pad had pressed more on the outer edge than he would have. The stride leading to it existed, but his eyes didn't want it yet. He squatted until the muscles complained and told himself, there are reasons for everything, and some reasons leave no literature. He swept the porch because that was a thing he could do that made the world slightly more legible. He boiled water and made coffee and wrote a line on the legal pad. Nocturnal visit. Likely animal. Investigate later. He considered taking a picture and decided the day did not need more screens than it already had. Wind came up from the west and ran a finger across the spruces. The light at noon turned pale and thin in the way of coastal Maine when the weather is deciding whose idea it will be. He worked until the lines of the text began to swim, and then he stood and stretched and told the cabin, walk as though the cabin were a dog. He put on his boots and the jacket with the respectable zippers and went out past the wood rack and the split stump and the line where porch becomes yard becomes threshold. On the far side of the clearing, the trees closed their ranks. A path of sorts followed the edge, not made by people exactly, not the way parks make paths, but by deer and moose and the long patient insistence of things taking the easiest route. Evan took the path, not because he had an intention, but because the woods like you better when you pretend you do. He went 100 yards and the cabin vanished behind trunks and needles. The air smelled cool and a little metallic, as if someone had put a penny on the tongue of the day. He found scat and named it deer. He found a snapped twig and named it wind. He found a tuft of hair caught on a stub and named it winter. He found, at last, a place where the frost had been scuffed by something learning. The scuffs faced toward the cabin, then away from it, then toward it again. He stood with his hands in his pockets and felt the particular loneliness of being the only human witness to something that had not decided whether humans were worth its trouble. He turned back before the trees became their own weather. The cabin reappeared, small and good and achievable. He put his boots on the porch and banged them together and went inside and made soup from a can with a picture of soup on it. He read and the words did their solid duty. He worked until the window forgot how to be a window and became a square of dark. The third night began with a mistake. Evan had left the oil lamp burning on the table near the front window and sat writing at the other end. trusting the pool of light to do the narrow job of keeping him company. He had been careful the night before not to stand directly in the window. This small superstition had felt like skill. Tonight he stood to stretch, forgot himself, and let the lamp turn him to a figure. He saw the reflection first, himself taller than a room allows, the lamplight ironing his face. Then he saw the other thing, outside, a dark oval where a head would be, not pressed to the glass, not shy either, simply occupying. He froze, not out of fear, but in the way a person freezes when a photograph is being taken and he hasn't decided on his expression. The oval shifted, the light bent. Something moved across the porch, not heavy, not light, exactly the weight a careful decision makes. He reached for the lamp and turned the wick down until the room kept a memory of brightness. He waited. The waiting creaked in the bones. When the sound came, it came from the other side of the cabin, the side with the smaller window and the shelf where the mason jars sat, each containing a different plausible screw, a touch on the pane, then a sliding as if someone were measuring the glass with a string. Evan stood between windows and let his eyes adjust to two kinds of dark. He did not speak. The cabin seemed content with that. Minutes, a word incapable of counting correctly in such situations, passed. The touch changed from measuring to tapping, then back to measuring. The sequence repeated in a way that suggested learning rather than habit. He had the sudden, embarrassing thought that if he pulled the curtain aside and showed the thing how a latch worked, it would be grateful. He smiled at himself in the dark, which felt like licking a finger to turn a page no one else would ever read. He didn't open the curtain. He moved to the stove instead and set the kettle on without a flame. The empty ring clicked once, a small punctuation. Outside, the measuring paused. The pause itself felt alive, like a mind might when it decides whether to speak a name it has not yet fully learned. Sleep came obliquely that night, not as rest, but as a bargain between exhaustion and decency. He woke to a different kind of quiet, mornings, and looked automatically to the floor by the door. There lay something the color of old water, paper, not paper, a sheet, thin and not wholly dry, like a page taken from a book that the weather had written. He crouched. The smell was faint and wrong in a way that refused drama. He did not touch it. He stood and made coffee and drank it and touched it only after his hands had learned to be steady again. There was a mark on it, a single curve begun and then abandoned. It could have been the top of a letter if the alphabet had more patience. He folded the sheet and set it beneath the salt shaker. He thought, absurdly and tenderly, that if someone had brought him a picture, he should display it on a refrigerator he didn't have. He drove into town that afternoon, not to complain and not to prove anything, but simply because people make a room less like a sentence and more like a paragraph. The diner was the kind that deserved its mugs. A fly wrung its hands against the window. The waitress poured coffee like a person who had poured coffee before. Evan asked her about the winter, and she told him about an ice storm 12 years back when the town learned the names of its neighbors again. He asked about the woods, and she said they were good until they weren't. He asked about animals, and she said deer, moose, bear, coyote, fisher, and something else. The something she didn't name, because it didn't matter to call a thing what the old men called it if the day had not asked for that word. On the way back, he noticed a pair of tracks crossing the road where the snow had been shallow enough to keep an opinion. One set were boots. The other belonged to something that had made a choice not to belong to boots. He pulled over and stood with his hands in his pockets and watched his breath go tidily into the air. The boot prints came from the south and went to the north and were accompanied in places, departed from in others, overlapped briefly like two people deciding whether to walk together or apart. He followed them into the ditch and up the shallow bank and lost them because the world has been doing this longer than we have. Evening returned him to the cabin, and the cabin accepted him as if he had not left. He made dinner, he cleared dinner, he stood at the window and let the outside decide how it wanted to be seen. The trees were less separate tonight, knit by a thin, voluntary fog. The sky had declined to decorate itself with stars. He turned the lamp down sooner. He did not stand in the window. He placed the salt shaker on top of the knot paper and imagined that somewhere, in a ledger he would never be allowed to see, the act had been recorded and assessed. They came later, and when they came, they did not knock or scrape or test. They breathed. The sound traveled along the walls like a person running a hand across them, not seeking seams, but learning how the boards spoke. From the back of the cabin came a second breath, as if a separate lesson were being held there. From the roof, a third breath lowered itself into a long exhale and lifted again. If fear came, it came as a question rather than a demand. Would he be the kind of person who answered invitations from the dark simply because the dark had been polite? He did not. He stood with his hand on the back of the chair and let the breaths make their narrow weather and go. In the middle of this, a fourth sound emerged, faint and far and not aimed at him. A woman's voice from the woods, low and succinct, speaking a word that chose a boundary without asking for a vote. The breaths paused. The house remembered how to be still. The voice did not come again. He slept with the ease of the truly tired and woke with the guilt of someone who has missed a conversation he knows would have told him something he needed to know. Morning wrote new things in the yard. On the fence post nearest the spruce, someone had left 3 small items: the head of a nail rounded to a coin by years in a road, a button the color of tea, and a sliver of something that had once been leather if leather could remember being alive. He didn't touch them. He stood with his hands in his pockets and nodded the way neighbors do when they don't know whether to wave. He could have left then. He thought about it, and the thought didn't insult him. He had learned enough for a month of stories to tell no one in particular, but a person's sense of the ordinary is a stubborn animal. He stayed because staying seemed like a continuation of a sentence he had started without meaning to. He made coffee. He wrote 3 paragraphs he did not throw away. He set another log and waited for the stove to reward him. He listened to the day. He let it have him in the useful way days sometimes do. Dusk brought a snowfall that never committed to being snow. Dry confetti of sky, occasional, indecisive. He sat at the table with the lamp turned low and the knot paper folded beneath the salt shaker and the window reflecting only the idea of a room. He was thinking, for no reason and every reason, about a pond he'd known as a boy and how it had swallowed stones with such courtesy, when a voice spoke just outside the door, quiet and unhurried, as if picking up a conversation that had been paused mid-sentence. "You should sleep," it said. It was a woman's voice, but not the waitress's voice. Not any voice he had properly owned. It belonged to someone who had learned the tempo of patience by counting snow. "I will," Evan said, "because there are times politeness is the closest thing to courage." "Don't look," the voice said, and perhaps it was a kindness, or perhaps it was the last part of a lesson that needed to become muscle. He obeyed. He did not go to the window. He did not open the door. He turned the lamp down and let the dark resume its duties, which were many and, tonight, not unkind. He slept until a dream woke him, a simple dream, a stare in the woods with no house to justify it, a railing that led to emptiness, and, beyond that emptiness, a sense of having been observed with mercy. He lay awake for a long time after that, and let the cabin hold him up the way a boat does when you stop rowing. When morning came, the items on the fence post had been rearranged. The button sat on top of the nailhead now, and the sliver of leather had been bent into a shape like a half-drawn letter. On the porch, under the window where he stood most often, a single print had blossomed in the frost. It was cleaner than the one before, less hypothetical. The toes understood themselves better. The weight had moved inward toward a human center. The stride to it from the yard had almost learned to be a walk. Evan did not take a picture. He nodded again, a little, then more, until he felt ridiculous, then less ridiculous. And then he went inside and put water on the stove and waited for the fist of steam that says, "Absolutely, yes, another day has chosen to continue." He did not know, as he stood there in the plain light with his hand around the mug that contained more comfort than coffee, whether the woods loved him or merely tolerated him. He knew only that they had made room for him without asking what exactly he was, and he thought, without being able to justify it to any court, that his part of the exchange was as simple as closing the door gently and leaving it closed even when the knocking sounded like a person who had learned the word "please." Outside, the trees exhaled together. The breath traveled across the clearing and through the cabin and out the other side. He did nothing to stop it. He let the air go where it wanted. He stood still and listened to the clean, ordinary miracle of being left alone.